Page 566, Great Britain. Okay, Great Britain. While the rest of the continent was embroiled in revolution, Great Britain had a relatively tranquil time on it. There were about three big reasons for this. Reason number one was the Reform Act of 1832. The Reform Act of 1832 took power away from the nobility and gave almost all the power to the House of Commons. Now, Britain kept its nobility. Britain kept its queen. But the king, well, in this case, the king who was in charge in 1832, King William, let his power all be taken away in favor of giving it to the Prime Minister. So from that time to this, the Prime Minister has been the real power in Britain as far as, being the one man who's in charge, not the king, but the Prime Minister. And the House of Lords still exists. There are still dukes, there are still counts, there are still barons, viscounts, but they have no real authority. So the Reform Act of 1832 gave most of the power to the House of Commons.
Most of the power to who?
The House of Commons. All right, Britain has two houses like we do, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but the House of Commons has all the power. The House of Lords basically is just a mere figurehead. They can't do anything as far as governing, just like the Queen of England. She can't do anything as far as governing, but she's merely a figurehead. And I was asked more than once, why does Great Britain choose to keep the Queen? Tradition. They've always had a king. They read about their kings in their history books, and they want to, I guess they want to have a king and a queen now. So they still have their queen. Now, another reason for Britain's stability was economic growth. Their economy continued to grow throughout this period. And the average person found he had more opportunity in Great Britain than anywhere else in Europe. So a person could rise up economically. He was not put down by the system. Not as much in Britain as he was in other places. Another reason that Britain didn't experience revolution was due to the influence of Queen Victoria. Okay, I can see if some of you are hot. I just got an email about the heat in the building. The air conditioning is not working in this building, and they're working on it, but there's nothing we can do about it. So I'm sorry about the heat, but hopefully that will be fixed shortly. All right. Anyway, Queen Victoria. She has reigned, as of this moment, she ruled Britain for longer than any of Britain's monarchs. 1837 to 1901, 64 years. Our present queen, the great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth II, has been on the throne 61 years. If she can last 3 more years, she'll equal her great-great-grandmother. If she can last 4 more years, she'll break the record. Queen Victoria's mother, by the way, Queen Elizabeth, lived to be 101. If Queen Elizabeth II lives that long, I mean, not Queen Victoria's mother, Queen Elizabeth's mother lived to be 101. Her name was Elizabeth also. Queen Elizabeth's mother lived to be 101. So if Queen Elizabeth II lives as long as her mother did, she will shatter Queen Victoria's record. Queen Victoria, again, she was so popular that her reign has been called the Victorian era, and the people of Britain were quite proud to be one of her subjects. Now, on a personal note, Queen Victoria married, had a few children, and then abruptly and unexpectedly her husband died. And this led to a little characteristic of the Victorian era that your book doesn't mention, but the Victorian era is known for its hush, hush, we don't mention that attitude towards sex. After all, the Queen wasn't doing it, so we don't want to mention it. The Victorian era is the only era in history that has a whole line of poetry that can be read by children. Again, the Victorian era somewhat influenced my generation. I have a first cousin whose mother grew up late in the Victorian era, and he can tell you that one day in a conversation he used the word pregnant, and his mother slapped him across the face. And, don't do that, that's illegal. Shut your mouth. We don't talk that way around here. This actually happened.
He said pregnant?
He used the word pregnant in a conversation, and his mother slapped him across the face. But see, again, my grandmother, who was born in 1895, was about 8 years before Queen Victoria died, well, no, about 6 years before Queen Victoria died, was highly influenced by Victoria. And again, sex was a taboo subject, hush hush, we don't mention that. Now, when I was younger, we talked about the Victoria. Oh yeah, during the Victorian era, women didn't have legs, they had limbs. And everything about a female anatomy was covered up. Again, this was the way that they believed that women should dress. Everything covered except for their face and maybe their hands, and oftentimes they even wore gloves on their hands. Completely covered. Now, fast forward a little bit to 2014. This attitude is fast coming back in our world today. You might say, really? Well, I'll tell you something in the workplace, folk. If you're a man, hush, hush, you better not mention that. I spent 27 years with Lockheed, and I can name you some men who got fired for what's called sexual harassment. And I can tell you about a friend of mine who, this didn't happen at Lockheed, but it happened after he got laid off from Lockheed, doing a big layoff. He came into work one day, like any other day, and he was stopped by security at the parking lot. And the security told him he was fired for sexual harassment. Well, he called into his boss, who was a female who had hired him, and said, "What's the matter? What's going on?" She said, "Several women have complained about you, and we terminated you." What did he actually say? What he admitted to saying, he would say such things as, "That's lovely makeup you have on," or "That's a lovely blouse you have on." But what they said, he said, was so bad I'm not going to repeat it here. Now, when I gave this story out, one pupil said I would fight it. Let me tell you men something. Something like this is extremely difficult to fight because these women had ganged up on him and they would join together in witnesses, and it was his word against theirs. Right, do a makeup point. I mean, this actually happens a lot of places in the workplace. Again, in the workplace, don't mention that. All right, and again, the Victorian era, as soon as Queen Victoria died, the women started dressing in bathing suits on the beaches, and a lot of them, of course, a lot of things changed pretty fast after she died. But while she was alive, her influence did a lot to promote somewhat extreme modesty. All right, so much for the Victorian era. Well, one other thing I must say about Britain. They had two main prime ministers, Disraeli and Gladstone. I promise you I'm not going to ask them on the test, but I think they at least deserve mention. The politics during this time went back and forth between Disraeli, who was a Jew on one side, and Gladstone, who was another. And I must say this. I mean, I know this school's a little Jewish community, but some people believe that one reason Britain prospered when the rest of Europe didn't. There was a strong anti-Jew sentiment on the continent that was not shared in Great Britain. Great Britain treated its Jews better than most other places in Europe, which may have contributed a lot to the prosperity of Great Britain at the expense of the prosperity of the rest of Europe. Now, you can take that for whatever you wish to. Anti-Semitism has become so strong that it led to the Holocaust of the 1940s, which we will talk about later. In fact, I'm going to have much more to say about anti-Semitism. Now that I've used the word, I'm going to tell you, what is anti-Semitism? I mean, I've got most of my students don't seem to know, but you'll run into it throughout your life. Anti-Jew, the hatred for Jews. We'll run into this term next chapter, so I'll introduce it to you now. Anti-Semitism. The word comes from, of all places, Shem. the son of Noah, who was the ancestor of the Jews. Again, if you, it was anti-Shemitism or anti-Semitism, hatred for Jews. Britain did not share in it, and again, some people believe that led to prosperity with Britain. All right, leaving Britain for a while. Hey, again, we could spend an entire semester talking about Britain in the 1800s, Victorian era Britain. There are college courses offered in it, graduate level courses, 1800s, Victorian era Britain. But we have to move on. France. Now, unlike Britain, France experienced revolution on top of revolution. Revolution in 1830, revolution in 1832. Again, for more info, see yesterday's lecture on the iCollege link where I talk about it in some detail. But the year 1848, now I keep being asked, how many day stories to remember? Well, the ones I write down, among other things. The year 1848 is known as the year of revolutions. The revolutions Europe experienced always began in France, including the one in 1848. It ended with the overthrow of France's last king and Napoleon III, who was nephew of Napoleon I, taking over. Napoleon III took charge in 1848. He was not like his uncle. He did not engage in a big program of conquest, but instead he engaged in trying to build up France and was popular at first. For 12 years, 1848 to 1860, the people liked him. He modernized the city of Paris, put up wide avenues, replaced the crooked streets. His reasoning was that the crooked streets made it easy for revolutionaries to come in and sneak in on the palace. But he reasoned if he put wide, straight streets, the revolutionaries would not have as good a place to hide. He expanded industrial growth, constructed railroads, he even built harbors, canals, roads. Most of the major French railway lines that we have in France today were started during his reign. Now, your book does mention the narrow streets were destroyed and replaced by modern Paris of broad boulevards, spacious buildings, circular plazas. They've improved the sewage system and put up street lights of gas. This was before the electric light bulb was invented. Well, make a long story short, another date I remember is the year 1870. Napoleon went to war against Germany in what's called the Franco-Prussian War. The French believed they could easily defeat the Germans, so they engaged. The Franco-Prussian War was a quick war. One battle, bang, and it's over. And France had lost miserably. After the end of the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon's government fell to pieces. And finally, France, who had been promised democracy as long ago as 1792. They were promised democracy in 1792, promised it again in 1830, in 1832, but finally in 1870, France got its democracy. It took many, many years. All right, in Austria, the only thing I remember about Austria is they had what they called the dual monarchy. In effect, they had one king over two countries. The two countries were Austria and Hungary. Austria and Hungary united together under one monarch, and they called it the dual monarchy. Each nation was allowed to keep its own parliament, have its own money, have its own government, in effect, under one king. the idea did not work very well. Austria remained a weak nation, one of the weaker nations of Europe. The monarch was Franz Joseph, who ruled from 1848 to 1916. Don't worry about the dates.
What was his name?
His name was Francis Joseph. I call him Francis Joseph. That was 52 and 68 years, folk. He was the emperor of the dual monarchy. It ended, he died in the middle of World War I. It was his son who was assassinated that got World War I started. Again, we're going to be hearing more about Joseph later, Francis Joseph. Here's head of the dual monarchy. All right, Russia. Russia lost the Crimean War, again, which I've skipped that part with this class, but you can get it online. Russia lost the Crimean War, and they began to realize that, hey, we're behind the rest of Europe. I mean, they felt utterly humiliated, but they didn't want to change. And again, if you look into detailed history of Russia, you'll find that much of their history in the last 400 years has been a history of a people who know we're behind, let's reform, well, we're behind, what reform should we make? And they still were behind. And even during my lifetime, they were behind and trying to catch up, behind and trying to catch up. Same here. Behind and trying to catch up. But finally, in 1861, Tsar Alexander III, don't remember his name so much, but just remember he freed now, 1861, does anybody happen to know what was happening in the United States in 1861? That might be related. What's that? Civil War started. Yeah, excellent. The Civil War started, and the main issue, really, I mean, some Southern historians have tried to say the main issue was states' rights, but the main issue was really slavery. And this has been shown, particularly the Union soldiers who went to fight. They were fighting over the issue of slavery. But in 1861, the Russian Tsar, with a stroke of his pen, freed some 5 million serfs. At this point, all the serfs in Europe were now free. The Enlightenment had said there shouldn't be serfdom. Other nations in Europe had slowly freed the serfs. As for Napoleon, everywhere he conquered, he freed the serfs. When he conquered northern Italy, he freed the serfs there. He freed the serfs in Holland. Of course, the serfs in France were already freed. Everywhere he conquered, he ended serfdom. But finally, now, before him, another Tsar, before the one in 1861, had wanted to free the serfs, but the nobility wouldn't let him. But by 1861, Russia was embarrassed to be the only country on the European continent still had serfdom. And I really think in the case of the United States, if some people in the United States would have had more patience, the issue of slavery would have ended by itself, partly because the slave owners would have been ashamed to be the only country in the world. I mean, well, I think Russia was embarrassed to have serfs, and later, in 1880, the last Western nation to free, Brazil, freed its slaves. Why did Brazil free their slaves? I think they were shamed out of it, largely. I mean, here, we're the only nation on the earth that still has slavery, and, you know, they were somewhat shamed out of it, and I think that was the case of Russia. Anyway, Alexander II, who had freed the serfs, made some other attempts at reform. Again, Russia, the whole story of Russian history is a story of reform, but the reforms never seem to be enough. Anyway, finally Alexander II was assassinated, and he was replaced by a son who was against reform. But then what happened next is a subject for a later chapter, but to make a long story short, Russia was to eventually fall to communism. And the events that's going on in Russia now is to lead to the communistic takeover. All right. Your book talks about the European state. Democracy was becoming more the norm in places like Great Britain and France, but autocracy was becoming the norm throughout much of Central Europe and Russia. Again, what I mean by autocracy, autocracy to rule by one man, autocrat. One man governing. Democracy, ruled by the people. And democracy was growing in Western Europe, particularly in France and Britain. In Central Europe, Germany built up the most powerful army on the continent. Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm, who reigned from 1888 to 1918. And you may know that he was deposed in 1918. He lived until 1940, but in 1918 he was deposed because President Woodrow Wilson of the United States wanted him deposed after Germany lost the war. But he built up the most powerful army in Europe. And knowing as he did that Europe had the most powerful army made him think that he could do anything he pleased. He tried it, and he wound up being a hoe man in a small plot of land in Holland, hoeing a garden like a commoner, completely devoid of his titles, devoid of all his wealth, fled his country, and but he thought that he could conquer the world, even as Napoleon tried to, and even as Hitler was later to try to. Kaiser Wilhelm built up a powerful army. Oh yeah, your book uses the term anti-Semitism here in the middle of page 570, as it in dark bold print. And your book mentions that Germany was flaming the flames of anti-Semitism during the time, and this was to lead to the Holocaust of the 1940s, which occurred about 60 years or so after the events of this chapter. All right. Your book mentions that Austria had a problem with various nationalities, Czechs and Poles and Slavs and Germans and Austrians all living within the same empire. They did not get along together. In fact, Hitler claimed that he was a German, even though he was born in Austria, and when he said that Germans in Austria are oppressed, and used that as an excuse to take over. But it is true, a lot of Germans were living in Austria at the time. All right, in the case of Russia, it wasn't enough that they were humiliated in the Crimean War in the 1850s, but in 1905, the Japanese made a sneak attack on their Port Arthur and took Port Arthur from them. Now this event was significant, and it was the first time an Asian nation had defeated a major European nation in a battle. Actually, it was the second time. Ethiopia defeated Italy. All right, Ethiopia defeated Italy once, and Japan then defeated Russia. The year was 1905, when Japan took Port Arthur from the Russians in a sneak attack. Now, does anybody know of another story where Japan decided they could make a Navy sneak attack and win? What's that? Pearl Harbor, yeah. 1905, well, in 1941, about 36 years later, when some Japanese could still remember it, 36 years later, they decided, hey, we're going to make another sneak attack on a big nation, and this time we're going to win. So they made another sneak attack on the United States, only this time they didn't win. In the case of Russia, they got away with it. This humiliated Russia even further, and led the Russians to feel so humiliated, began to plan to rebel against the Tsarist regime. And of course, this was to lead to the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917. Now, the Ottoman Empire continued to be called the sick man of Europe. Your book tells you that the events in Europe at this time were leading up to a big war. Now, except for the Franco-Prussian War from 1871 until 1914, Europe was almost without a war. No bloodshed, hardly any, but everything in Europe was very uneasy. And the fuse that was destined to light up Europe was the Balkan region. Now, when I talk about the Balkans, I'm talking about Greece, Macedonia, Albania, Bulgaria, the peninsula between Italy and Turkey, the Greek peninsula. This is known as the Balkans. And it has sometimes been a tinderbox that has set Europe off, and this has become very true in 1914. Now, again, it's not that these events aren't important, but what your book talks about on page 571 is going to become extremely important when we come to the chapter on World War I. But for now, we're going to just say, hey, there was tension in Europe. We'll go into more detail as to why later. Moving on to chapter 20. Before I start chapter 20, though, I'm going to pause and call roll. Men, Daniel, Denishu, we, Zolma, okay. Jamie, Gage, Crew is here, Evan Goodwin, here, Evan, right. Clarence Porty, right here, Lillian, Jonathan, Lauren, Suyong, Cynthia, Jessica, Jackie, Leonard. Okay, I'm missing men, Daniel, Denishu, Hui, Jamie, and Lauren. Most everybody over on this side. Yes. All right. Book starts off leaving Europe for a time being, but hey, believe me, we're going to get back to it. Latin America. In Latin America, beginning in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Spain controlled most of it. Now, the biggest country in Latin America is Brazil. Brazil was controlled by Portugal. In addition, the French had a little bit of Latin America, and the British had Honduras and British Guyana, and Jamaica. Yeah, the British had a few places in Latin America also. But when Spain got involved in wars with Napoleon, all of a sudden the people living in Latin America saw their chance to revolt. Realizing that Spain could not send an army to quench the revolts, or at least not a big enough army, all the countries of Latin America, except for the islands, engaged in revolts that freed themselves from Spain. Now, one exception, Brazil did not free itself from Portugal. Brazil was to remain largely under Portuguese control, partly because I guess there was more conflict. But two men did a lot to lead the revolts. Their names were Simon Bolivar and San Jose de San Martin. Now, I don't want to make it sound like that Spain didn't send any army at all and didn't try to hold on to its Latin American territories. They did send armies, but the armies just were not big enough to quell the uprisings. But the country of Bolivia, by the way, is named after Simon Bolivar. Anyway, Simon Bolivar dealt largely with the northern part of South America. And San Martin, the southern part, Argentina and Chile. Let me just change that stuff. Again, if you know anything about Latin American geography, the two long, thin countries at the tip of South America are Argentina and Chile. And San Martin did a lot to free them. Inevitably, the two men had to get together and coordinate their efforts, and to his credit, San Martin agreed to take a back seat and let Simon Bolivar lead. Otherwise, the revolutionaries might have started fighting among themselves. And by the way, this is similar to what happened in Italy. In Italy, there was Cavour and Garibaldi, and Cavour took the lead, and Garibaldi said, well, you go ahead and take the lead. Otherwise, if they just started fighting among themselves, Italy might never become united. But as it was, these men, some of these men behaved very unselfishly and let the other man lead. It was not easy. Simon Bolivar had to lead an army through some of those Andes mountains, and it was very cold and the air was thin, and the men became sick, and so did some of the animals. When he got down below the mountain, he found the Spanish army, knew he was coming, was waiting for him. Nevertheless, he defeated the army. And that's the story of San Martin, who was surrounded in a city by a Spanish army, and someone got the brilliant idea, hey, why don't we just stampede all the cattle right smack on the army, then we have our troops follow behind the army. So they lined up all the cattle they could get, got them spooked, and got the cattle to stampede right into the Spanish army. And San Martin's troops followed and routed the Spaniards. And again, it was not easy. But when it was over, most of these countries had gotten a victory over the Spanish. Now, one exception was Cuba and Puerto Rico. These islands just felt like that, hey, we don't have a chance, there's no place to run, no place to hide. So they did not rebel. All of them got their independence. Well, the United States took over Puerto Rico and still has Puerto Rico to this day. As for Cuba, the United States helped them get their independence. But one of the countries that also got its independence this time was Mexico, our neighbor right south of the border. Mexico got its independence in 1820. The problem with Mexico, though, that after getting their independence, they were never able to really form a good, stable government. And folks, that applies from the year 1820 now to the year 2014. I'm talking about 194 years. Mexico has never really had a stable government, and if anything, the situation in 2014 is worse now than ever has been. Anybody happen to know what I'm talking about firsthand? I mean, not being critical. Huh? They have an elected president, but he doesn't seem to be in charge. What they have is a bunch of drug cartels and drug lords who take over and
pretty much put the president up there. So.
Pretty much put a president up there, and he's not really capable of doing anything against the drug lords.
They're in charge of the president.
They own him practically, and he doesn't dare make a move against them. And the result is a whole lot of chaos, a whole lot of corruption, a whole lot of crime, and nobody can do anything about it. And if anything, the situation is worse now than it ever has been at any time in history. I want to say this about democracy. I mean, your authors sometimes seem to assume that the best kind of government is democracy, and democracy always works, and democracy always brings about happiness and prosperity. I've got something to tell you, a little secret. Democracy has only worked in countries like Scandinavia and Great Britain and the United States. Otherwise, most other places where it's been tried, it has not worked very well, particularly the Far East and Latin America. Anyone want to contest that, you're welcome to. I mean, I don't mean to be offensive to anyone, but just simply stating what I have observed as a fact. And again, no offense to any of you who might be of Latin American origin, but it's just simply what I've done. Now, in the last 20 or so years, now, 40 years ago, democracies were not working at all in Latin America, but in the last 20 or so years, for most of Latin America, democracy has worked. And Latin America is starting to prosper, except for Mexico. And maybe a few others. But Argentina seems to be doing well, from what I've heard. Brazil, doing really well. for a while, I even invested some money in Latin America with mixed results, but they seem to be doing really well. They had an economic boom there about 6 or 7 years ago that somewhat fizzled out. Mexico, terrible. Now, your book uses terms like mestizo, and these are people of mixed race. There's several words that's used. The Latin Americans did more mixing of the races than was generally popular in the United States, particularly Indians and Africans mixed, and Africans and Spaniards mixed. And they were quicker to develop a racial equality than even the United States was, and quicker to overcome their racial hatreds more than the United States. Simon Bolivar has been called the George Washington of South America. I'd like to say I can see the comparison. They had one thing in common, George Washington and Simon Bolivar. They both revolted against the European overlords, and both won after a bloody struggle. But the difference was George Washington became leader of a country that was on its way to greatness. The country Simon Bolivar freed, he said, in fact, he said, I know these people here are not ready for democracy. Maybe someday they'll be. And this was a lot of dictators used to take when they took over. They say, hey, I'll give you democracy once I see you're ready for it, but until you're ready for it, you need a dictatorship, you need me. And they would rule with an autocratic hand and justify it on the grounds that their people weren't ready for democracy, and in some cases spoke. It does appear to be justified. These people were not ready for democracy. In fact, some experts on the subject have said only a certain kind of people can have democracy. Most people are not that kind. You have to have people who willingly submit their rights, who willingly give up what their privileges and rights for the good of all, rather than being told to. Your book does mention the San Martin going over the high Andes Mountains, and 2/3 of the pack mules and horses died. And many of the troops also suffered. In the case of San Martin, he completely surprised the Spaniards he met and routed the Spaniards. Again, your book names the nations that Bolivar freed: Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile all became free states. Well, some of these were freed by Martin as well as Bolivar. Now, when the Napoleonic Wars were over in 1815, Spain asked the nations of Europe, hey, we'd like for you to pitch in and help us get our colonies back. The nations of Europe said, we're tired of war, we're not going to help you. But there were two reasons that the nations of Europe didn't really insist. Reason number two, according to your book, was the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe of the United States told European countries, if you invade the Western Hemisphere, we'll meet you with our Navy. But the main reason, what the Europeans feared most, was the British Navy. The British said, see, the British all of a sudden found that they could trade profitably with these newly formed Latin American republics, and get much more profit than ever had under Spanish rule. So the British, in effect, said to Europe, stay out of Latin America. Latin America is free to stay. So between the British Navy and the United States getting together and telling European nations stay home, and European countries feeling tired of war anyway, European countries did not venture in. with the result that these Latin American countries will remain independent. And they have remained independent to this day. The Latin American countries began as republics, and from that day till about 20 or so, 30 years ago, they were trying democracy and failing. Like I say, lately, most of them have finally adopted democracy and had some success with it. But these nations would start out with republics, and inevitably a dictator would take over. They'd eventually overthrow that dictator, try again a Republican form of government, and another dictator would take over. And the story of Latin American history throughout much of the 18 and early 1900s has been a story of one dictatorship taking over after another, some dictators more successful than others. And as for your dictators, your book says some of them were modernizers who built roads, canals, ports, and schools. And others were extremely harsh and destructive. And your book singles out one of the worst dictators in Latin America, a man named Santa Anna. And you might guess, he was a Mexican. This will take a few, I'm going to do it anyway. Starting with me. This is me, my father, my grandfather. All right, 3 in a row. Then if the names change, Mary, his name was mother's name Mary. And then from Mary you get Percifer. Percifer's father was Richard. Richard had a twin brother named Percifer. Now why am I doing all this? This Percifer, who was a twin brother to my great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-great-grandfather, was slain by Santa Anna. He was one of 365 Americans whom Santa Anna rounded up and shot before a firing squad for no reason, weren't even in active rebellion. You might can guess, folk, I have no love for Santa Anna. In one of my dreams, I dreamed I was about to face Santa Anna's firing squad. I mean, this is a little bit of family history, but anyway, this one, great-great-great-great-uncle, twin brother to my great-great-great-grandfather, lined up. Well, Santa Anna paid for that. The Texans finally rallied to got together en masse, and caught Santa Anna in a siesta. Now, if any of you have been to Latin America, know the Mexicans like to take siestas. And I must say, a lot of doctors say it's a good idea. Take a sleep in the afternoon, and you'll wake up more alert and refreshed. But Santa Anna took a siesta, not knowing where the Texas Army was. And while he was in the middle of siesta, the Texas Army swooped down on him, and Santa Anna ran pell-mell from the battlefield in his purple underwear. And again, if you're in a military situation, you see your commander-in-chief tear off from the battlefield, what do? You follow him, yeah. My dad once said even it's been happened several times, even in our own history, where the commander-in-chief, the leader, the top general would take off running, and every time he does, his troops always follow him. Santa Anna did not know that Sam Houston and his men had 750 men, and he had 600. I mean, he had 1,600, they had 750, but instead, he took off running. His troops all ran. Sam Houston's men went around rounding up Santa Anna and his troops, and they forced Santa Anna to sign a paper giving Texas her independence. So no, the United States did not steal Texas from Mexico. Texas stole itself. Texas stole itself. Now, you can say the United States took California, New Mexico, and Arizona, and Nevada, but not Texas. Texas took itself. And again, why did my great-uncle, great-great-uncle here go to Mexico? Here's why. I mean, go to Texas. Here's why. They were told, the Americans were told by one government, you come here, you can have a plot of land, you can farm it. Because at this time, Mexico could not get its citizens to move into Texas. So they told him, you can come in, but then another government would take over and they would say, get out. Another government would take back over and say, you're welcome here. He thought he was welcome. And he wound up lined up before a firing squad. But as a result, the Texans who were left got together and they drove Santa Anna and the Mexicans out of Texas. Again, I can't feel sympathetic toward the Mexicans in this regard. I mean, I've had teachers tell me that the United States has done Mexico dirty. You can decide for yourself. I think that Mexico played a big hand in it. Due to their own lack of stability and lack of stable government. All right. No, I don't encourage hatred of the Mexicans, even though I guess I do encourage hatred of Santa Anna. I have no particular love for him. The Mexicans, the Mexican War, the war we fought with Mexico might not have been justified. In 1845 and 1846, the United States fought a war with Mexico and took from Mexico the territory of Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California. Took from Mexico. All right. Another problem that Latin America has had, and again, you can't sum up, because Latin Americans resent the people in the United States, sum us all up, hey, we're not all alike. We sum them up and say we're all Latin American. And they say we're not all, but they have had a few things in common. Number one, they've had an economic system where the poor are way down here, very, very poor. The very, very poorest people are called peons. The very poor are hopelessly poor with no chance of rising up, hardly. And then at the top you have your very, very rich, super rich, with nobody hardly in between. Extreme wealth on the one hand, extreme poverty on the other. Again, with nobody in between, just two social classes mainly. And they've also had a problem separating church from state. Church and state have much too often been one. And this is known to be bad on the countries that haven't separated church from state. As long as the church is allowed to be the church and the state is allowed to be the state, things seem to go better. But when the church starts meddling in the affairs of the state or vice versa, both sides seem to lose. And again, this is just a fact of history. Latin America could not separate church from state. The book goes on to talk about Diaz. Again, I'm now looking on page 583. Diaz ruled Mexico for several years, but unfortunately during his time, Mexico became even poorer. The average Mexican became even poorer. And eventually Diaz was forced from power by another dictator. And again, folks, don't worry about the names so much, just note the pattern. This dictator would take over and he'd try to straighten things up, and after a while he'd be shut down. As the political winds changed, another dictator would take over and he'd eventually be shut out. And this was to be Latin America's history for about 150, 180 or so years. Your book mentions too that a lot of the poor people went to the big cities. Now I want to say this about the big cities. What are the 4 biggest cities in the world? I'm not sure I know anymore, but when I was a kid, the teachers told us the 4 biggest cities in terms of population are not necessarily in right order, but London, New York, Berlin, and Tokyo. But today, what are the 4 biggest cities? Probably up from what I heard, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo. Anyone recognize some of those names? They're all Latin American cities. Again, I've heard that. Now, if any of you know any differently, you're welcome to intervene. But I've heard that population-wise, and I don't know which one's the biggest, but they're supposed to be the 4 biggest cities, and 3 of them are right on the Atlantic coast of South America. The other one, Mexico City. I mean, I've been to Mexico City, and I will say this, it is huge. All right. Again, we could spend an entire semester talking about Latin America, but we must leave and go to the United States. The United States set up a constitution and swore in a president. Now, I hope all of you know who our first president was? George Washington. Maybe you don't. But George Washington was our country's first president. And they're lately saying that of all the country's presidents, he was the richest. Just 2 days ago, we celebrated President's Day. He probably, in terms of modern money, in terms of the land he held, was probably our richest president. Thomas Jefferson, back Alexander Hamilton was not a president. Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's financial advisor, Secretary of Treasury, and he got set up the banking system that some people say went on to make America really great, that we have a central bank. Now I say that tongue-in-cheek because the final chapter I've written, I have heard some people really criticize Hamilton severely because this central bank, while it's lasted more than 200 years, is slowly and gradually eroding away our economy, putting us deeper and deeper and deeper into debt, until one day we're going to find ourselves so deep in we can't get out. But anyway, at the moment, Hamilton is still honored, and you'll find Hamilton's picture on the back of a $10 bill. No, he was not a president, but he was a Secretary of Treasury. But anyway, Jefferson and Madison tried to decentralize and make the federal government less prominent and less intrusive. In the meantime, though, I mean, again, if you were taking American history, you would spend a whole chapter, pardon me, you'd spend 2 or 3 weeks talking about what they're talking about in 1/2 a page here on page 584. We're going to have to move along fast. The United States continued to grow. We took in more and more states. We expanded westward. Napoleon Bonaparte eventually sold Louisiana Purchase to us. And eventually we fought a war with Mexico and took their territory. Texas became independent, but then Texas joined the Union. Spain sold Florida, and we just kept adding more and more territory until we got all the way to the West Coast. In the meantime, a Chief Justice named John Marshall usurped the power of judicial review. He said that any law passed by Congress can be nullified by an act of the judges. And again, I have to say this. I'll have to pause here. I mean, I'm looking at the middle of page 584. Does it seem fair to you that the Supreme Court can rule on an issue 5-4, and that issue become the fixed law of the land, and their decisions cannot be overturned? The last time a Supreme Court decision was overturned by a constitutional amendment, folks, was in 1912, 102 years ago. It was income tax. Congress passed an income tax law. The Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. So the Congress and the states got together and passed a constitutional amendment granting income tax. That's been 102 years ago. They can make a decision 5-4, and it's the law of the land, and it can't be overturned. Practically not. Congress takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of states to pass an amendment. And some of their decisions have favored criminals, have made it more difficult for the police to operate. And the reason I'm not teaching in public schools today, folk, and the reason my 3 children have never been inside a public school, I blame a lot of the problems with public schools on Supreme Court decisions, which sound great philosophically, but are impractical. Decisions that make it difficult for teachers to enforce rules and make it difficult for principals to enforce rules and give the kids the upper hand in almost every clash. And the result is teachers cannot teach. Now, if I'm wrong, tell me. I mean, I've had persons complain when I talk about the public schools, but other persons saying, to me, the American public schools are in such bad shape that they're beyond fixing. Anybody want to comment? I'll listen. If you haven't been in American public school, I mean, but they're beyond fixing. They're bad. Nothing we can do. We pour more. We pay our teachers more. We pour more money. American schools have the best lighting, the best heating, the best buses, the best climate control. the higher paid teachers in most other places, and they are sometimes called the nation's failing public schools. And I heard one talk show man say recently, any parent who would send his kid to a government, he called them government school, send his kid to a government school is guilty of child abuse. The kids there fear for their own safety, fear of being bullied. Hey, folks, I mean, everybody seems to be listening. I mean, even though some of you who were asleep, something got awake, which I mean, but if you want to comment, say something. I mean, at least I seem to have your attention. Speak up. If you want. I mean, if you don't like what I'm saying, hey, tell me right now. I won't argue. I'll just listen. I'll have my word. You can have yours if you want. I mean, some of you may never been inside an American public school. Again, I blame place a lot of the blame on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules our country like a dictator, and as long as they're in charge, we don't have any option. The Supreme Court makes all of our moral decisions for us, not our elected officials. They define our morality. They make laws and they can legislate, and their laws cannot be overturned. I've been around long enough to see many a law passed by Congress that was overturned by this later Congress. Judges seldom reverse their own decisions. All right, John Marshall was the justice who did it. Andrew Jackson helped make the country more democratic as more and more people got the right to vote. Now, originally, folks, the way our founding fathers set it up, only land-owning white males could vote. Now, I have to state it. It was only land-owning white males. Then it was the poor people, the poor men could not vote. Women could not vote. Women did not get the right to vote until about 1920. We'll talk more about that later. But eventually they expanded. They said, well, hey, some people are successful with their own property. So then they said, well, if you're a successful businessman, then they finally decided they couldn't decide who was successful and who was not, and they let anyone vote. Any white man, that is, vote. Pardon me. I have to tell it the way it was. I mean, it's not that I want to open up old racial wounds, but at the same time, I can't sweep under the rug. I mean, only white males could vote. Then eventually, gradually, slowly, laws were passed and extended the vote to former slaves, to blacks, and then eventually to women. And believe it or not, the last of all people to get the right to vote was the Native American Indian, whose rights were finally respected even after women had gotten their rights. Now, our country became increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. And particularly as we expanded into the new territories, mostly toward the west, the issue came up, should slavery be allowed in these new territories or not? And this was an issue, folks, that really was a tough one to decide. I mean, I've tried to put myself back in that time era and argue the issue. The problem was, particularly when gold was discovered in California, and there was a big gold rush. I mean, everybody rushed to California. And then, when they got there, they found there was no law. Well, President Taylor told the people of California, organize yourself for statehood, which means you have to draft a constitution. The problem was, California was a southern state. I mean, if you look on a map, it was in the south, and therefore it should have been brought into the Union as a slave state. Except that 90% of the men who went there said, we don't want slavery here. So they wrote up an anti-slave constitution, which they called themselves a free state. And they simply said, we're not going to have a slave state here. And they finally, though, after working out a compromise, where California was admitted to the Union in 1853. Again, they had to organize for statehood because they had so much crime. And without a governor, without a legislature, without judges, they could not punish the criminals. They could not build jails. They could not bring justice. So they worked hard to get this state organized, but they came in as a free state. Well, that was in 1850. The agitation continued. There was a big issue in Kansas and Nebraska. Again, if you were studying American history, and some of you have, you'd go into more detail about this than I'm going to. But to make a long story short, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and some southern states said, if you elect Lincoln, we'll leave the Union. Well, hey, Lincoln only got 40% of the vote. But the problem was the Democrats split the vote between three men. see if I can remember the name, Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell, yeah, the Democrats split their vote. So because the Democrats split their vote, Lincoln, whose name wasn't even on the ballot in any of the southern states, Lincoln carried the northern states, which had more population, and with 40% of the popular vote, Lincoln was elected, and the southern states decided we're going to leave, and I must state, I think most of you already know, Georgia was one of the states that left, 1861. Now fast forward to 2014, there is now talk again of leaving the Union, but I'll leave that because that's, I don't know where that will eventually come, but a lot of people in America are unhappy, just like they were then. Anyway, 11 states left the Union. And then the states that left the Union said that all the government property that's in our states is ours, and they took over 24 of the 26 forts. The only ones that didn't take over was Fort Sumter and Fort Pensacola in Florida. When Fort Sumter would not surrender, the Confederates fired on it. And the people of the North said, hey, they fired on our men and on our territory, let's go get them. And this led to the bloodiest war in American history. Before it was over with, 600,000 people were killed. Not to mention, that is more than we lost in all our other wars combined. And the reason they lost so many was that they were using 1860s weapons, but fighting with manuals that were 1700 manuals. In other words, the fighting, everybody would stand up straight and tall and shoot at the enemy. But when you were using repeating rifles, I mean, in the old days, you could do this. Everybody would fire one shot, then step back and reload. The next month, they'd fire one shot and reload. But all of a sudden, these men were shooting 5 or 6 shots before they... And the result was, it was just devastating to the human life. They would not fight. Now, late in the war, some of them started fighting in trenches. But at first, I mean, Stonewall Jackson, Federal General said, the battlefield is not for the trench or the foxhole. The battlefield is for those who get up and fight it. Stonewall Jackson, if he were alive today, he wouldn't last but 30 seconds at that long in a modern-day battlefield. Today, your troops are trained to fight from foxholes and trenches. But in those days, they fought out in the open, and the result was it was just simply devastating. The South problem was they could not afford their losses. The Southern troops killed more Yankees than the Yankees killed them, but the South could not afford the losses they had. The Southern generals were fighting as if they had the same amount of men that the North did, and that was devastating. Sam Houston told them at the beginning, well, Sam Houston was a Northerner who was governor of Texas, but resigned when Texas left the Union. He said, I can't leave the Union, so he resigned as governor. But he told his fellow soldiers, you think you'll beat those Yankees because you're better. I said, I know, you're better than they are. You're better fighters. You're more used to the outdoors. But what you don't know about those Yankees is they will keep on coming back. You'll whip them, and they'll come back. You'll whip them again, they'll come back. And you'll whip them again, and they'll come back. And I said, they're going to win because there are more of them than there are of you. And you can't handle them all. They can handle you in the long run. And the reason, remember those words, is they prove to be so true. Man for man, the Southern soldier was better. All right, anybody want to comment? Make a long story short, I think all of you know, eventually the war ended with the South having to capitulate. The South surrendered and rejoined the Union. The main accomplishment of the Civil War was it permanently ended slavery. Yeah. Any of you studied American history, any chance? I mean, in college, on a college level? Okay, a few, oh yeah, a few of you, yeah. You spend a whole period talking about the Civil War, but we won't. Eventually it led to, all right, when the war was over, the United States grew again as a nation, the economics grew. In the South continued to lag behind. But the North developed more and more people began to move into the big cities. It's called urbanization, industrialization. Cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston grew ever larger. Moderate-sized cities such as Pittsburgh would grow by leaps and bounds. And eventually the United States became the world's richest country and the greatest industrial power. the wealth was not always equally distributed. So the United States had a lot of reform movements. The Progressive Era, they tried to reform things like make senators have direct election. Oh yeah, the income tax was one of the reforms. Before the income tax, the federal government could only raise money by tariffs. And again, if you study American history, the tariff was such a big issue. But the tariff has somewhat fallen behind as far as an issue because the United States now has the income tax, and the corporate taxes, private income taxes constitute most of the money the government gets. There are still tariffs. No, there are no tariffs on exports. That was outlawed by the Constitution. But imports, goods that we bring into the country, there is a duty or tariff that has to be placed on them. Eventually, the direct primary came about. Notice today our presidential candidates are nominated by primaries. Before this, our presidential candidates were nominated by party bosses who met in what was called smoke-filled rooms, and they would hash out who would be the candidate, or they'd meet in conventions. Now today, there's still party conventions, but the party convention has already decided who the candidate's going to be before the election, before they even meet. But at one time, the convention chose the candidate. All right. Anyway, the United States eventually became a world power. In 1898, we fought a war with Spain called the Spanish-American War. I got to say this. I can see our time's running out, but a lot of times small wars will occur that will lead to a bigger war. I hope that's not true in this case. We're fighting a small war right now, but it will lead to a bigger war. But in the case of the Spanish-American, it was a small war. In a one-sided war, we easily defeated Spain, but it got us trained and prepped up for World War I. It came later. But as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States got the Philippines and Puerto Rico and several others, and we freed Cuba. We took and kept the Philippines for several years. We took and still have Puerto Rico, and we got some other islands in the Pacific, Wake Island and Guam, and we also took Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. Now, we didn't take them from Spain. We took them from Hawaii. Again, some people criticized us for it, but we took Hawaii and eventually annexed Hawaii as a state. All right, we'll leave there this time.